monopolies and antitrust law and all this sort of stuff. We were talking with Congressman Bob Ney just a minute ago about how this the sixth largest bank in America is about to be created by the merger of two other banks, and this whole thing of monopoly and antitrust law, and how the antitrust laws were either changed or the enforcement of them was changed in the 1980s. And the influences behind that. On the line with us is Professor Barak Orbach. He is a professor of law at the University of Arizona, the James E. Rogers College of Law, one of the nation's most well-known authorities on antitrust law. Orbach, ORBACH.org is his website. You can tweet him at Barak, B-A-R-A-K, Orbach, O-R-B-A-C-H. And Dr. Orbach, welcome to the program.
Thank you much for having me on, Tom.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope I'm pronouncing your names correctly and everything?
Yes.
Okay, great. I read an article that you wrote some years ago that it was so informative and it was so astonishing to me about how Robert Bork changed not just American antitrust law. I would argue that he changed the entire nature of this country. You know, it's so hard now for entrepreneurs, for example, to start new businesses, to find a foothold because of these giant corporations. And I think most Americans, when they hear the name Robert Bork, they think, oh, wasn't that kind of crazy right-wing guy that Ronald Reagan wanted to put on the Supreme Court? You know, he had a funny beard and he couldn't quite pull it off, and he just kind of faded into obscurity. And Bork wrote a bunch of rants about, you know, the threat of homosexuals and you know, how women getting abortions was going to destroy America and stuff. And I don't think anybody realizes who he really was or what he did. So, in my setup here, did I go off on any weird tangents or point anything out that was not part of the story? And B, if not, then can you please tell us, and by the way, this is our Conversations with Great Minds segment. We're going to have this conversation for the half hour. Can you please tell us who Robert Bork was and how he influenced our country?
Well, let me just say that everything is a matter of perspective. So the way you describe him is probably the way most liberals would describe him, but certainly not the way conservatives would think about him. They actually admire him. I think that everyone would agree that during the nomination he had a funny beard, but otherwise conservatives and liberals are likely to have a strong disagreement over him. And what is particularly important for the purpose of antitrust law is that the majority of the justices, and including the liberals, think highly of his writing in antitrust. Mm-hmm. So that's something to keep in mind.
He was a very smart man, a very articulate writer and jurist. Yeah.
I think that it is true that everyone could agree that he was a very smart man, and everyone could agree that he was an excellent writer. Many people probably would not agree with what he wrote about antitrust. And there's another thing to say about it. One thing is that most of his ideas were not entirely original, but rather they were ideas that were up in the air in the 1960s and 1970s. The thing for which he is credited the most that actually was innovative and not in any significant or not in any positive way was that he introduced the concept of consumer welfare, which is the stated goal of U.S. antitrust laws, which for us, or for most people, the phrase consumer welfare may mean many things, what may be good for consumers, but for Robert Bork it meant one of two things, either low prices or high quantity, which is not the way we would think about it, or most people would think about it. So, for example, low prices and many cigarettes would be consumer welfare under his definition. And a lot of media, but low-quality media, would also be fine from his perspective. So it is a very different perspective, and this is something that he created and the Supreme Court adopted. So that's probably the most significant thing.
So can I try to rephrase that in a way that makes sense to me? It used to be, I mean, you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, that or really the late 19th century. The Sherman Act was passed, as I recall, in 1890. That the idea of antitrust was to prevent companies from getting so large, or a group of companies from conspiring in a way that they were so large that they could control markets, that it was anti-competitive, that would block out competitors, that would prevent smaller companies from getting into the business. There was collusion issues. John D. Rockefeller famously cut deals with the railroads where they charged him a lower price than they did for his competitors to transport his oil and his kerosene. And, you know, some of these you could say those were competitive. Some of them were just, you know, basically lockouts. And so most of us understood antitrust law as, you know, restraining this, you know, big fish eats the little fish to the point that there's no more little fish thing in the marketplace. And Bork said, let's flip that upside down on its head. Really, the purpose of antitrust law is not to regulate the behavior of giant corporations. It's to make sure that consumers, that we the people, always can get the lowest price or the best quality at the lowest price. Do I have that right?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. So that was his focus. He said, you know, it doesn't matter how many companies we have in a market, whether they're large or small, and probably large companies are more efficient than small ones. And generally, that's correct.
So if everything that everybody buys in America comes from two companies, Walmart and Amazon, whether you want to go out and get it or have it delivered to your home, if we ended up with just two retail companies in America, that would be fine with Robert Bork as long as they keep prices low.
Yes. Yes, but because, you know, for him, there was kind of a general big picture. There were no details.
Yeah.
That, well, if we have Amazon, that we all use it and buy products for low prices, that's fantastic. But there are things that cannot work that well. For example, we may have less innovation because there's one company that dominates the market, or we not have certain products that otherwise we would have had. So it is quite difficult actually to balance the difference, the desire to have many products for low prices, and yet to have innovation and new products on the market.
So you would think, looking at this, that, you know, when Bork comes along and says, you know, if everybody in America has to buy everything from one company, Walmart, that's just fine as long as they keep prices low. People would say, wait a minute, you're going to destroy innovation when you do this. You're going to ultimately put them, you know, you're strengthening their grip around the necks of all of us. And his response to that was what?
His response to that would be, well, if people want innovation, that company would be innovative. That's how he believed.
Uh-huh.
So,
is there evidence that he was right?
No, yes, there's an evidence that he wasn't right.
Uh-huh.
There's no evidence. You know, reality is not black or white. So it's not that if we have only small companies in the economy, we'll have plenty of innovation. Size is valuable for innovation. Mm-hmm. But it is probably true that if we have one company, we'll have less innovation than otherwise. So the truth is somewhere in between. Okay. And the desire to protect small companies is probably not economically efficient, but the belief that with no competition, we still have innovation and the economy will work well is quite naive as well.
So in the early 1980s, when Reagan came into office, the prevalent idea about antitrust, I mean, AT&T had just been broken up. I think that was initiated under the Nixon administration and wrapped up during the Carter administration, as I recall. And, you know, there was this broad consensus that produced much more innovation. It broke open the market for cell phones and the internet, and all kinds of cool stuff came out of that. And then Reagan came along and said, no, I like Robert Bork's idea. You know, we're not going to resist the Walmartization of America, and that's just at the retail level. At the industrial level, at the manufacturing level, he says, you know, it's all good, and that kicked off this explosion of mergers and acquisitions. Am I remembering my history right?
Yeah. Yes, I think that the way you describe it is probably the way most people would describe it, but I think that you give too much credit for Ronald Reagan. I don't know whether he actually read Robert Bork or how much he knew about what Robert Bork was thinking, but what we can know in certainty is that he felt that antitrust was too much interference in the market, and he appointed to the agencies people who were anti-enforcement or thought that antitrust should not be that aggressive. The more significant power, which tend to be overlooked, is actually the composition of the Supreme Court, that since the mid-'70s, the majority of the Supreme Court have been relatively conservative, if not the majority were conservative, and they tend to believe that Robert Bork was a great antitrust thinker. And that's probably true for some of the liberal justices on the Supreme Court today. So I would actually give much more credit, or not credit, much of the blame is on the Supreme Court than on the administrations.
Because so they were no longer enforcing laws about antitrust?
There are two separate things about enforcement. Enforcement in antitrust can be public enforcement, which is done by the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice or the FTC. But the majority of enforcement of antitrust consists of private actions. That is, that companies or consumer groups sue companies that allegedly violate the antitrust laws.
Oh, so it happens in the courts rather than the regulatory agencies.
Exactly. And the interpretation of antitrust laws is under the overview of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court interprets the antitrust laws. And what we have seen since 1977, this is probably the turning point, is that the Supreme Court has moving away toward more and more permissible policies and has developing a hostility toward antitrust enforcement. So much of that is about the Supreme Court, less Ronald Reagan and other conservative presidents.
Very interesting.
The credit that they may deserve is appointing justices. And Reagan appointed some justices who were relatively moderate. So Scalia was the most radical one, but Sandra Day O'Connor Sandra Day O'Connor or Kennedy were not that radical as far as antitrust goes or other things.
Fascinating. So I want to continue this conversation. We're talking with Professor Barak Orbach. He's a professor of law at the University of Arizona, the James E. Rogers College of Law, one of the nation's most well-known authorities on antitrust law. This has these changes in the 1970s and the 1980s have completely changed the nature of business, the nature of our cities, our towns, all across this country. And I'm just fascinated to learn how it happened. And welcome back. Professor Orbach, 1976 was the year that the Supreme Court, now they had Lewis Powell on the bench, was the year that the Supreme Court in the Buckley versus Vallejo decision ruled that essentially if a billionaire or a corporation, that kind of came later, I guess, in First National Bank versus Bellotti, but, wanted to own a politician or wanted to heavily influence an election, that was First Amendment free speech, and it kind of set up Citizens United. That was a major turning point in this country, and it seems like 77, the Supreme Court started defending companies against antitrust laws. It seems to me that those two decisions are kind of two sides of the same thing. Let's just let the giant ones, let's just let the billionaires, let's just let the very wealthy run things. Am I off base here?
You're absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right. But there are two things that perhaps deserve some kind of attention and more precision. One thing is that since the mid-70s, the Supreme Court has been persistently increased what they called corporate constitutional rights. So corporations receive constitutional rights or protected by constitutional rights that ordinarily we would apply only to human beings, not to corporations. And because corporations have more funds to deliver cases to the Supreme Court, they can expand the rights more than individuals. So the general trend, as it is perceived legally, is the expansion of corporate rights. And this would be, in the context you mentioned, free speech. It may be in the context of political donations, and it may be in the context of pro-defendant approach in antitrust. So all these things are absolutely related. There is another force that is important to recognize, is that we are in the midst of industrial revolution that began in the 1970s, mid-1970s. So these two things are related. Much of the growth of companies is because of dramatic technological change. At the last time we have seen such a fast technological change was at the turn of the 19th century when the Sherman Act was enacted. So these are two separate things. We should definitely be proud of the technological revolution. It brings many great things, but we should also have some policies that create some checks and balances for these companies, because the economy is changing, and that's what we don't have.
How did we have that in the 60s and we don't have it now? Can you give me an example?
Yes. So, for example, and the example is actually not as good as you may think. We did not have a good antitrust policies until the mid-70s because we had a bunch of sentiments that were targeting to protect small companies and were hostile to large companies. But there was no criterion of when a large company is large, or why do we need to have many small companies, or what is small, or how many companies does the market need? Do we need to have 100 companies or 12 would be enough? Or there are other issues for which we can evaluate competition. So we did not have any systematic system. So most antitrust people would say, antitrust law was not great until the 70s, which was quite messy. It is more organized since the 70s, but probably too permissive.
That's fascinating. And then the Supreme Court took an axe to it. I want to get into that. What were those decisions and how were they decided? Professor Barak Orbach, our conversations with the great minds today, professor of law at the University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. His website, Orbach, orbach.org, where you can read, for example, the article I was talking about, Robert Bork. Professor Orbach, you said that it was in the mid-'70s that the Supreme Court basically made a turn and stopped enforcing or supporting the antitrust laws as they had been understood back to the 1880s, and instead basically adopted Robert Bork's perspective that as long as consumers had access to low-cost stuff, it didn't matter how it got there, essentially. What were the, if I'm characterizing this right, or if I'm characterizing it wrong, please correct me. But in either case, what were the decisions and what did they say and how did that come about?
So most people would agree that the GTE Sylvania in 1977 was the turning point of antitrust.
GE in Sylvania?
GTE Sylvania.
Oh, GTE Sylvania, right. Okay, that was one company.
Yes. Yes, so it was a one company, and in that case, what the Supreme Court held is it created a clear distinction between vertical agreement, which are agreements along the production and distribution chain, for example, between manufacturer and distributor, between distributor and retailer, and horizontal agreements, which are agreements among competitors. And the Supreme Court said that vertical agreements are generally lawful, or it would create difficulties to prove that they're violating antitrust laws, and horizontal agreements are suspicious. The other thing that GTE Sylvania did was determining that the economics is the key methodology to analyze antitrust laws and not other values. So this is one. Go ahead.
So adding value is not a big deal, and it's okay if a manufacturer and a distributor collude essentially, but it's not okay, which is, in my recollection, is what Rockefeller was all about. But it's not okay if a company colludes with conspires with a competitor.
No, it is absolutely wrong to collude with your competitor. So
right.
Horizontal agreements among competitors are the big no-no, supposedly. Mm-hmm. But agreements, vertical agreements between manufacturers and distributors, between manufacturers and retailers, are generally legal.
Yeah.
So that's where we are now.
Professor, we just have 30 seconds, so we're going to hit a hard break at the end of this interview. Is there any movement to roll back Robert Bork's worldview?
Yes, absolutely. So the progressive movement that has been gaining steam since the Great Recession has very strong feelings about the large companies and technological companies. And they try to suggest that what they do is replicates what happened at the end of the 19th century. They're partially correct and partially wrong. They're as radical as Robert Bork, but in an opposite direction.
Fascinating stuff. Professor Barak Orbach, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the enlightenment on these issues. This is fascinating stuff. You can find his website is Orbach, orbach.org. You can tweet him at Barak, B-A-R-A-K, Orbach. Thank you so much again, Professor Orbach. We'll be back.